Let me start with the truth. I love anime. I love the emotion, the courage, the training arcs, the music, philosophy, and the heartbreak. But today's episode isn't about anime in general. It's about one specific thing: the pervy moments. The sexualization of characters who are clearly meant to read as young, sometimes too young, or are placed in youth-coded settings like school. I'm talking about the recurring tropes where the story plays sexual tension like it's a joke, the accidental situations that aren't really accidental, the lingering framing that feels like it's for the viewer, not the story, the gag character whose whole personality is sexual boundary testing. We see this in, Seven Deadly Sins. And the moments where youth-coded characters are treated as part of the appeal. And here's my honest, messy opinion on this. I can see why it's problematic, especially through a Western lens. And at the same time, I've laughed at the comedic versions of these situations. I've expected them. I've become numb. I've turned a blind eye because I'm there for the story and I'm already emotionally invested, which raises the question I can't ignore anymore. If I'd find this deeply wrong in real life, why does it feel so easy to shrug off when it's animated? And if that shrugging becomes normal, what is it doing to us? So welcome back to Between Worlds. I'm Alex, and today is a focused conversation, not a pile-on, not a moral panic or anything like that. It's just an honest investigation into these pervy tropes and youth-coded sexualization in anime. Why it's there, why it gets laughed off, and what do we do with it as fans? Now, this episode here is again, it's not here to disrespect Japan or Japanese culture or anime fans like myself. It's not here to shame anyone, including me, for laughing at these comedic tropes. And it's not here to turn into, everything is corrupt in society. Not at all. This is a thoughtful conversation about media, context, and I guess how humans adapt to storytelling norms. We can love something and still analyze it, and we can laugh at a joke and still ask what it trains us to ignore. And we can do all of that while respecting cultural differences. Also, I'm going to keep this discussion non-graphic, non-explicit. We'll talk about broad terms because the point is the ideas here, not the details. So before we go any further, I want to make the target obvious because I don't want this episode to feel too abstract. Here's what I'm not talking about. I'm not talking about adult characters being attractive. I'm not talking about two consenting adults flirting in a story. And I'm not talking about teen romance written for teens when it's respectful and not framed for an adult gaze. But here's what I am talking about. The recurring pervy moments, seesaw that anime sometimes plays with, where the joke, the framing, or the fan service involves someone who is explicitly underage or youth-coded, like school settings, kid sister framing, childlike design cues. And the scene still invites the audience to look at them with an adult-coded lens. So I say pervy moments, I mean things like the accidental gags that aren't really accidental, the same setup repeated like a routine. Camera language that lingers on bodies instead of stories, the shots that feel designed for the viewer. The bath or changing room style jokes uses this kind of comedy punchline. The quote-unquote perv character archetype whose whole identity is boundary testing. You get this in My Hero Academia. You get this in it's so many. School uniform aesthetics being treated as some type of feature and not just a setting. And so to make this even clearer, if the exact same scene were done in live action with a clearly underage actor, most of us would feel immediate alarm. But in anime, style and distance can make the alarm quieter. That's the core tension. Think of the last anime you watched that hit you with a pervy moment. Did you laugh? Cringe? Did you skip it? Did you barely register it because you've just seen it 100 times? Think about it. So, if you've watched a lot of anime, you've probably seen some version of these, the peeking gag, someone tries to spy on a private moment and it's played for laughs, consequences are pretty much comedic. The trip and fall gag, the same accident setup that ends in an inappropriate contact. The I don't know, the punishment gag, the perv is punished, but the scene still centers around the voyeurism of it. The school setting fan service gag, uniforms and suggestive framing treated like the flavor of the show. And even the young coded character framing, the story tells us they're young or designs them to read young, yet still frames them as appeal, you know. And I want to be careful here, but some popular shonen and mainstream series have well-known pervy archetypes, the comedic character who can't stop commenting or pushing boundaries. And some series have been, criticized for how they frame school-age characters, even when the main story is incredible. So when I when people say it's anime, they're usually talking about this whole cluster of tropes. And this episode is asking what happens when the cluster includes youth encoded characters. See, part of the discomfort comes from a cultural mismatch. In the West, a lot of people grew up with the assumption that animation equals kids. Not always true anymore, but it's still in the background. And so when an anime includes adult humor, adult themes, or suggestive framing, it can feel like it's invading a child's space. But in Japan, anime isn't a single category, it's a medium. Where anime aimed at children, anime is aimed at teens and even adults. So sometimes the shock is partially a labeling problem. We're watching something that isn't for kids, but our brain still has the cartoon association. That doesn't excuse everything. It doesn't, excuse anything at all, but it does explain why the emotional reactions can be so strong. So he- here's where I need to be real. There are times the comedic version lands. I'm not going to lie. Not because I want real life behavior to be creepy, but because comedy is often built on an awkwardness, an embarrassment of, social panic. It's the same reason people laugh at someone slipping on a banana peel. You're not saying you want them to be hurt or injured. You're reacting to the absurdity of it. And a lot of anime uses this exaggerated cartoonish reactions, the panic, the scream, the over the top consequences, the immediate karma. So my brain reads it like slapstick, you know. But the moment I admit that, I have to ask, what exactly am I laughing at? Is it the joke, the awkwardness of it? Or is the joke violation? Because those are not the same. And it's the second one, that's where it gets ethically uncomfortable. When you laugh at a scene like this, what part are you laughing at? The character's embarrassment, the absurdity, or something you'd never want in real life? This is the psychological core of this episode because I've noticed something in myself, and I think many fans will relate. At first, those moments feel jarring. Then you see them often enough that your brain just goes, this again, and you move on. The process becoming emotionally less reactive to, repeated stimuli is basically habituation. It's how humans adapt. It's why you stop noticing a ticking clock. It's why you can watch action movies with explosions and not feel like you're in danger. Your nervous system learns this isn't real. This is a pattern. I don't need to, spike emotion here or there. So yes, part of the numbness is just your brain being efficient, I guess. But that leads to the real question. Does habituation in fiction spill into real life? Does it change what we tolerate? Or is it safely contained inside the, this is not real folder in our minds? Most of us would say, I'm fine. I can separate fiction from reality. And I think that's often true. But I also think if we're being honest, stories still shape us. Not like mind control, more like a gentle training, like a lens that slowly shifts. Do you think you're completely untouched by the media that you consume? Or do you think it's quietly, calibrates what feels normal to you? Now, I need to talk about the part that's generally hard to defend. When younger characters are framed in sexualized ways, it's weird. That's not just cultural difference. That's a line where a lot of Western viewers rightfully go. and we say, no, this isn't good. This is wrong. And here's my honest truth. I've seen it enough times that my brain almost files it under anime nonsense. And I hate that. I don't like it because in real life, I would have a major issue with this. So why does fiction create this numbness in me or in us? A few possible psychological reasons that I've looked into, is art style abstraction. Some fans mentally de-age or de-realize characters because they're drawings. There's genre normalization, which is the trope that appears so often it becomes like a background noise, like the ticking clock that I mentioned earlier. And then you have context switching. Viewers treat it as a different cultural space with different rules. It's a different world, different universe, essentially. And then there's kind of like this compartmentalization. I don't bring this into real life. I separate it here. But none of those explanations are the same as justification. That's really important here. They just explain how the human mind can tolerate something in fiction that it would reject in reality. Now, do you think compartmentalization is enough? Or do you think repeated exposure still matters, even if you never intimate it? So this is where people usually split into extreme camps. You got one camp that says, it's just fiction, calm down. And then the other camp says, this is poisoning minds. We have to get rid of anime. And I don't think either extreme here is actually helpful. Here's the more realistic middle that I think. Media doesn't affect everyone the same. A mature adult might watch something and keep it fully contained, but a kid who doesn't have the context might internalize weird ideas. And that's where the conversation changes from, is this art allowed, to where is this being shown and who is watching? As a dad, that's the practical angle, because I'm not trying to ban anime. I'm trying to be intentional about what my kids would absorb. And the truth is, kids learn what's normal from repetition, but that doesn't mean they copy everything. It means their baseline shifts. And so for society, the question isn't anime will ruin people. It's what norms are being repeated to what audience with what context. Now, we reached a big fork in the road. Do we ask anime to change? This is a big, big question. Or do we accept that anime comes from a different cultural context and learn to read it differently? And in my opinion, it's both. Because cultures they're not frozen. Anime has changed over time, and some modern series use less of these tropes or handle them kind of differently. And at the same time, as Western viewers, we sometimes import anime without importing context. We binge it like it's Netflix comfort food. We meme it, we quote it. We don't always stop to ask, what is this normalizing? What is it? What is this making me ignore? And do I want that? I don't think the answer is guilt. I think the answer is awareness. You can love anime and still say, yeah, I'm not rocking with that part. And you can still laugh at, slapstick energy while refusing to normalize the parts that cross that line as well. It's not hypocrisy. That's discernment. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Anime is hilarious when the humor is about, friendship, ego, the pettiness, the competition. Like when a character takes a tiny insult personally and turns it into a 3-episode rivalry. Bakugo and Deku, like this, you see this happen all the time, right? That's elite. That's human. But when the humor starts requiring someone else to be objectified for the jokes to land, that's when my brain now goes, okay, why is this necessary? And the more you notice it, the harder it is to unsee, which is kind of the point of this whole episode. Here's where I land, honestly. I'm not trying to cancel anime. I absolutely love anime. I love it. But I'm also not trying to pretend every trope is harmless. I'm going to be more intentional, especially around what I recommend, what I, want my kids to watch and what I normalize. Currently they're watching Dragon Ball Z and, there are some things in there, but for the most part, I think it's okay. I think it's okay. And I'm going to keep my sense of humor because comedy is part of why we watch it. I like laughing at the dark things in the world because I think the world is dark enough that I need to be able to see the light in that darkness. But I'm also going to keep my moral clarity because being a fan doesn't mean switching your brain off. It just means you're willing to sit in complexity and honesty. That's what good storytelling trains us to do. It trains us to hold two truths. One, I love this, and two, I'm not blind to its flaws. What's the one thing you love that you can also critique? And can you do both without becoming cynical? This episode wasn't about condemning anime. It's about noticing what repeated stories do. Anime is a mirror of the culture it comes from, and it becomes a mirror for us because we bring our own values into it. Some tropes are just jokes, and some tropes are signals. Some tropes are leftovers from older entertainment norms, and some tropes are worth pushing back on. Not with panic, but with thought, with context, with a grown up ability to say, yeah, I'm not taking that part with me. But if you love anime, I think the healthiest move is not denial, it's awareness, because when you can name what you're seeing, you're less likely to be unconsciously shaped by it. This is Between Worlds. I'm Alex, and if this episode made you think or made you uncomfortable in a useful way, follow, subscribe on your podcast platforms and on the YouTube channel. In the next episode, we're going to be looking at aliens as mirrors and why we keep imagining life beyond Earth. I'm Alex. Until next time, stay curious, and I'll meet you between worlds.